Open Media, we believe conversation about our beliefs, particularly across difference, is a spiritual discipline, not a political tactic. And we're here to show you how to do it. I'm Alessandra Biaggi.
And I'm Kendall Ceasmeyer.
And today we're joined by Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action, the largest grassroots group fighting gun violence in the United States. Known as the summoner of women's audacity, Shannon Watts organizes and mobilizes women to create political, electoral, and cultural change. The day after the Sandy Hook mass shooting tragedy in 2012, Shannon inspired the success of Shannon inspired by the success of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, started a Facebook group to unite women against the gun industry. Under her leadership, Moms Demand Action became the largest grassroots group in the nation, with a chapter in every state and over 11 million supporters. In just a decade, Moms Demand Action volunteers passed over 500 gun safety laws, stopped the gun industry's agenda in state houses 90% of the time, elected thousands of gun sense candidates to office, including its own volunteers, and passed the first federal gun legislation in a generation. Her most recent book, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age, was an instant New York Times bestseller. Today, she joins us to discuss how, at a time of increased political violence, polarization, and a federal government that has shown almost no desire to seek common ground or negotiate across difference, she stands firm in her commitment to reducing gun violence in the United States of America. Shannon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Shannon, what a bio.
Yeah.
Like we had to cut things out of that bio, quite honestly. It's stunning. It's so stunning. Sorry to cut you off, Alessandra.
That's
I just
okay.
was like, wow, the impact is incredible.
It
Thank
is.
you.
I mean, and just for some listener context, that's okay, Kendall. It's true. I've known Shannon since my early days in the New York State Senate, where she truly has made New York State a safer place because of her gun safety advocacy, including things like passing safe storage laws and banning ghost guns and the sale of bump stocks to the passage of red flag laws. We are so grateful to have you here today because of not just the impact that you've made in New York, but across the country and what you continue to do every day, frankly, in the face of many, many odds and a lot of cynicism. So we're pumped to have you.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, Shannon, I want to take us back to a really pivotal moment in your life. You've said that December 14th, 2012 started like any other day. You were folding laundry, watching the news. So, when the Sandy Hook story broke, what internal rumblings were happening in that moment that propelled you into action? And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your internal world.
It's funny to think back on 2012 because it seems like light years away from where we are right now. So much has changed. I think I had a Twitter handle, but I wasn't on Twitter. Facebook, I had like 75 Facebook friends. And
Wow.
it was just becoming a really popular platform, particularly with middle-aged women who kind of took it from young kids. And it was just a really unique and interesting time to try to create an organization. And, at the time I lived in suburban Indiana. I have 5 kids and they were ranging in age from elementary, high school to college. And it was a really cold day. I remember folding laundry and suddenly there was a breaking news. I just had like CNN on in the background. There was breaking news that there was a mass shooter inside an elementary school in Connecticut. And what happened was the entire nation was so distraught and so devastated and so upset about what had happened. I went to bed in tears that night because we'd all watched 20 children, 6 educators slaughtered in the sanctity of an elementary school. But at some point during the night, that sadness turned into abject rage. Like I woke up just so agitated, I did not know what to do with myself. And I was born in 1971. So when I came of age, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was very influential. I can remember being in my high school classroom and seeing these moms bring a tow truck and bring a car onto our school grounds that had been in an accident. It still had blood all over the windows. It was like, this is what happens when you drink and drive. And these women were just a force of nature. They didn't even have social media. Like, I don't know, did they call each other on their rotary phones? Did they drive to each other's homes? Did they send snail mail? I do not know how they accomplished what they did in a decade. It's kind of amazing in hindsight. But I thought we need a MAD for gun safety. We need
Mhm.
women and mothers to rise up. And so I just created a Facebook page that said that.
Wow.
And like I said, I had 75 friends on Facebook and it went viral. My 75 Facebook friends shared it with their friends and on and
Yeah.
on and on. It was one of the
Wow.
first things to go very viral. And I think I was on the front page of USA Today a week later.
Wow.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of what I thought was going to be an online conversation very quickly turned into an offline movement because of social media.
Wow.
It's interesting that, so many of us that have started something usually have this moment where it was just like one tiny heart action, like one little thing that we did that just like spurred so much more than I'm anticipating you could have ever like had imagined at the time when you were just like posting it. You were just
Yeah.
in your house thinking like this is messed up. We got to do something. And that's so often how these things go.
Yeah.
And yet I think that like people often think that it's much more sophisticated than that. It becomes sophisticated, but it usually doesn't start out
No.
sophisticated. But I wanna talk to you about, like, what in you in that moment decided that, like, it wasn't too like, the sadness was overwhelming,
Mm.
but so was the impetus to do something because I think that there's a difference between grief that can immobilize us and grief that can mobilize us.
Mhm.
And I wonder how you tell the difference and kind of how you have seen that difference play out in your work.
I kind of think now that I'm 55 years old, I've known enough people that it feels like we all have a go-to emotion at our
Mhm.
core. My husband often says his is loneliness. Mine
Hmm.
is
Oh,
anger.
wow.
Wow.
And so when I feel any emotion, I can very easily transmute that emotion into anger. And when it becomes anger, it becomes actionable. Now,
Mm.
anger is a double-edged sword, right? There are plenty of times in my life where my anger I've used in an incorrect way that has caused harm to me or to other people. My goal in my life is to take that anger and make it, put it so that it is righteous and so that it
Mm.
creates movement and helps people. And I do think that, people often think I'm a gun violence survivor, which I am not. But I was so angry. And I do think the fact that I'm not a survivor allowed me to continue to tap into that anger. And, I think otherwise, if I were a survivor, I don't think I could have done this work because the
Mhm.
grief would have been so all
Mm.
consuming, or the sadness, or maybe the anger would have been too much to control because it was so personal.
Yeah.
And I really never stopped being angry. I was a full-time volunteer for Moms Demand Action for 11 years, and the anger never
Wow.
subsided because there's always a new horrific tragedy or legislation that was being put forward that was so exploitative and dangerous, or
Mm.
we saw the culture begin to become more authoritarian.
Yep.
And so my anger, I do think, is what fuels. Now, not everyone has to be angry because everyone does have an emotion and they should use it in the way that makes sense to them in activism. But, the other thing is, Kendall, you were saying like my bio was so impressive. And so many women come up to me and say, well, I could never do what you did because I'm a natural born leader, which makes me laugh because I have severe ADHD. I barely graduated from
Wow.
high school and college. I had a
Wow.
debilitating fear of public speaking. If you had told me this involved public speaking, I would not have started my Facebook page.
Wow.
I am an introvert and an only child. I knew nothing about gun violence organizing or the legislative process. Like, I am not the person people would point to and say, oh, that woman should take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that's ever existed. And yet I was exactly the right person for the job because all of those vulnerabilities and what some people might see as deficits were ended up being, and I know it's cliche, but like my superpower, right?
Yeah.
Because of my ADHD, I could spend 11 hours a day going deep in an issue that I really cared
Mm,
about and learn it. And that helped me eventually be able to speak, publicly to people because I felt so confident in what I was
Mm,
doing. And I had this skill set as a communicator because I was in public relations for a decade. All of the things
mhm.
that people would have said, oh, you're not the right person, or what made me the right person. And I want everyone listening to this, and women in particular, to know that, like, we are all leaders, every one of us.
That's
yeah.
so first of all, I want to just say that your background and having being an introvert and having those qualities, having ADHD and being afraid of public speaking is not at all what I think the public perception of you today is. So it's really important, I think, to let our listeners, but also us, know and see behind the scenes, because I think to the point you made that sometimes when we see leaders out there, I do this still to this day. I'm guilty of this. I say, oh, that person must have had bop, 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 or they must be equipped with da, 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 or somebody
Yep.
must have given them the training for da, da, da. But really, to the point you're making, it really just starts with this feeling and then the action on it. And then you following the whispers towards what you feel curious or angry about, and then letting it kind of take off. And I think it's such a testament to our spirit and allowing it to kind of come through us. And it's also something that I think from your example has allowed so many of the Moms Demand
Mm,
Action volunteers to transform grief into power, not just thousands, like tens of thousands of times. And
yep.
so what I'm curious about is like the patterns that you notice in how people move from devastation to determination, right? Is
Mhm.
it something that you think we can teach, or does it have to be caught? Like, talk us through that. Like, what, because I'm sure everybody's different, right? And every state is different. And every chapter is different in this country because they all have different issues that they're facing with their legislatures or the issues that they're dealing with in their community. And so I would be so interested to know how you identify that in others.
I think people self-select and identify it in themselves. I had been a manager of people in my corporate job before I started Moms Demand Action, and I had to sort of unlearn everything I had learned in the corporate world in order to manage volunteers because, these people weren't being paid. They were giving me their time and talent out of the goodness of their hearts. They really didn't want to hear no. And, they wanted me to lead them, which was, I found myself in, a very strange position. And we were all, especially in those early days, flying the plane as we built it. We
Mhm.
didn't really know what we were doing. But I will say that, my skill set was communications, but there were women who came to the table who were organizers, who were website developers, who were lawyers, who
Mm,
were policy experts, and on and on. And I had to trust that people wanted to get involved and help and then let them do those things, right?
Mm,
To not micromanage,
mm,
but to have enough control that it didn't go crazy, but
mhm,
also that people felt autonomy. And that's, I think, in when you're running a nonprofit, you're always trying to find equilibrium between not being too top down because it's too controlling, or too bottom up because then it's too chaotic. And you're always, going above or below and making people angry either way, and just really trying to stay in the
yes.
middle. And, it's not possible to ever stay right in the middle. But the other
mhm,
thing I will say is that when you come together in community, I mean, in those early days, and I get goosebumps talking about it. It
mhm,
felt like touching the divine. It felt like
mhm,
alchemy
mhm,
because we were all coming together, perfect strangers across the country, women who walked out of their jobs the day they San Hook school tragedy and said, like,
Wow.
I can't work anymore. I can't
mhm.
pretend like this is normal anymore. I remember I went to a yoga class the morning after, and I was like, how are we here doing downward dogs and not talking about what had just happened,
Yeah.
right? And so when you come together with people who feel so um, morally injured, or who feel like their souls have been insulted,
Mm,
you you find like-minded people who share your values, and that is sort of like that's the essence of life. That
Yeah.
feeling of
yeah.
community and coming together to do that. And I think women kept coming back and stay, or either staying or coming in because they wanted that feeling.
Mhm.
Mm,
Wow, that
wow.
is so powerful, and I think that is so interesting that you call it, like, divine,
Yeah.
because I do think that there is something, like, intangible to that feeling of a group of people working together forward for something good.
Yeah.
Good is
Um,
key.
and right. Yes, definitely. And I think that oftentimes the other thing that strikes me is that you were saying, I think if I were a survivor, I couldn't have been
Mhm.
doing this work. And I think so often we think, especially today, I think that there's this feeling that, oh, well, if it doesn't affect me, then I might not be the right person for the job. I might not know everything. I might say the wrong thing. I might do the wrong thing. I sometimes think we've created a culture where allies to a problem are are feeling so nervous to
Mm.
participate, so nervous to engage that they kind of just like say, "Well, that's not my place. That's not my place." And I actually think sometimes allies are the most powerful people to run to kind of like pick up new movements or put fuel on something because they do have a little bit of that distance that
Yes.
you've identified, but like both because they're not overcome with this grief, but also
Mm.
because they have this like wider perspective, perhaps. Do you find that thing that I'm noticing? Like, is that something that you also think? Like,
Yes,
was
and
that
it
something you were
I don't
concerned about?
I don't think I could start Moms Demand Action in 2026. I just don't,
Wow.
because I think our
Mm,
culture has changed so much that it would be like, first of all, who's this white woman and this white woman
Mm.
who's not experienced gun violence? And I'm not totally in disagreement with that. I'm not even sure how to have that discussion necessarily, or I'm not sure I'm the right person to have it. But
mm,
I think in 2012, there was a need for women generally to rise up, and there was a need for people who had not been impacted by gun violence to be
Yeah.
talking about the need to
sure.
address gun
Yeah.
violence. And I think it makes it a stronger movement when it's not just survivors, because it's a bigger movement and
Mhm,
it's powered by people who want to prevent gun violence.
Mhm.
right.
And obviously, survivors are the North Star of the movement. They're so important. Their stories are so important. But I do think there's something to be said for people getting involved and showing their skin in the game and showing lawmakers, that this isn't just a minority of people who've been impacted. This is the entire country who's
Right.
outraged and care.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting question, and I think things have changed. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I just think, as you said, it's like allies are more reluctant maybe, and
Yeah.
Mhm,
the pendulum swings all the time, and it will swing
totally.
back and forth until we find sort of the right place.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just always hope that it doesn't, dissuade allies from getting involved in something because I
Yeah.
think we need all different kinds of people to make a
Yes.
Yeah.
movement work, and to that end, I think one of the things that Alessandra and I were so excited to talk to you about is just how, wide your movement, grew to be, whether that was, many of your volunteers are gun owners or married to gun owners. I'm curious, like, what that dynamic the has taught you about, um, this, like, ability to hold space for difference, in the gun violence prevention movement.
And can I add one more thing too, Shannon,
Yeah.
if you could touch on this? And nuance, because I think nuance is also
Mhm.
required across difference,
And
and
Yeah.
difficult.
it's so difficult, and honestly, it's not really, like, click worthy, so it's
Mhm.
oftentimes, like, pushed to the footnotes of the conversation, but it is so necessary because there's so many more things that we have in common, but you'd never know that by
Yeah.
looking online or watching the news, right? So the nuance piece as well.
Yeah. I I think it's incredibly important to be able to hold the center, because on our issue, for example, when I started Moms Demand Action, I think something like 25% of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating back in 2012 from the NRA.
What?
25% of
That's a
Congress
lot.
members.
Wow.
Now, today, not one does. And that's a
Wow.
seismic shift in American politics, because our goal was to get them to distance themselves from the NRA by showing them that we had this group of moms and women who would have their backs. Now, if they didn't do the right thing, we'd have their jobs, right? Conversely. And we wanted them to both be grateful and scared. And the outcome of that was that no Democrat now in Congress has an A rating from the NRA. However,
Wow.
you're not going to win on this issue unless you do have the opposition, Republican Party also on board.
Right.
And so you do have to be careful about completely alienating them and giving them excuse to not vote for you, or to vote for your issue. And so they're threading that needle is not easy. And as you can imagine, with volunteers all across the country, that made it even more difficult. I can
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
in the first 5 or so years of Moms Demand Action, we did not come out against assault weapons because women in red states were saying, "That's a non-starter for me. I go to the state house and we're opposed to assault weapons. Like, they're not gonna even meet with me. They're not gonna talk to me. They're gonna say I'm an extremist and a radical."
Wow.
And so
Wow.
it was really after the shooting at Parkland
Hmm.
that our volunteers put so much pressure on us, rightfully, to change our public policy on this issue, to be against assault weapons, that we did change it. And I think that's important, right? You can't be solidly in a position for all of eternity, or your organization will not last. You
Right.
have to be open to evolution. And that was a really big part of our organization, which was like, this is our policy now, but that could change based on data, based on information. And I think the other piece that goes hand in hand with this is incrementalism. And that is a word that is very frustrating to a lot of people.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I love it. I love the word incrementalism, but especially young people, they really
Yeah.
hate this idea that the system is set up for slow, purposeful change.
Right.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's frustrating, and I do wish some of it made wholesale change easier, but
Mhm.
right now it doesn't. And you have two choices. You understand that incrementalism is what ultimately leads to revolutions, or you give up and don't do it because the steps are too small forward.
Right.
And that's why I do think women are often the secret sauce to organizing, because as women, like, we know what incrementalism is, and we know that if you don't give up, I mean, whether you're raising kids or, dealing with the patriarchy, whatever it is, like, it's not happening quickly.
No.
And that's why I think often women are in it for the long haul and see it as a long game. But when I started Moms Demand Action a few months after that, I was sitting in the Senate gallery when the Manchin Toomey bill failed by a handful of votes in the Senate, many of them Democrats who then had an A rating from the NRA. And then I also, again, was there when in 2022, when 15 Republican senators voted for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first federal gun safety legislation to pass in a generation. That was a decade of incremental change that ultimately led to
Right.
that huge revolution. So
Hmm.
I think both things are true. You have to have a wide, diverse movement that is patient and that understands that you have to be pragmatic. And none of that is sexy.
Yeah.
Not sexy.
It's not sexy. And I think also, when I first got into politics, I don't think I understood what incrementalism actually was, because there's a lot of historical context to incrementalism. And I
Yeah.
think, to the point you're making, that we could all benefit, frankly, whether it's like mentors in a legislature or partners in your advocacy efforts, like instilling in all of us patience, right? This, like, which is also divine when it comes to like large injustices, especially as
Yes.
it relates to gun violence. I mean, there's nothing almost that is more unjust than like finding justice for survivors and families. Um, and so it's really, to me, I think probably one of the most important things that I learned, and it's important to hear you say that. And I think that it probably is the reason why consensus has been built and 2022 happened. And we know just from, reading and watching the news, that a lot of gun owners and even
Yes.
families of gun owners, they support common sense gun laws, right? This is a fact in the United States of America. And so I think what becomes so confusing and frustrating and challenging is that, given that consensus, the conversation continues to be polarized and also stagnant. And so I'm wondering what you think is actually being fought over, if we have a majority of people agreeing we need common sense gun safety laws, but there is incrementalism, but in this administration it's a non-starter. Is a
Yeah.
zero. It's a 0% of any kind of progress.
Yeah.
So what do you think is at the core of that fight?
Well, I know. I mean, it's the lawmakers, right, who have bought into the gun lobby's rhetoric, who are
Mhm.
afraid of being primaried by the gun lobby. Back in those early days of Moms Demand Action, there were more lawmakers who were saying to us behind the scenes, like, "Don't give up on this. You will eventually win. You have the majority of the public on your side. We just have to create consensus and, move in that direction." But what I watched happen over a decade is that we started to elect we unelected the more moderate
Yeah.
Republicans, and we elected all of these extremists who actually believe the NRA rhetoric and
Mm.
disinformation, and who guns for many Republicans, guns have become an organizing principle. It's no longer just about guns. Like, guns is a great way to get young men in the door and then excite them on a whole host of issues that have nothing to do with guns, and to make
Mm.
Republican agitators a lot of money. And we never really accounted for that. Like, we absolutely dismantled the NRA, and yet this whole
Right.
infrastructure still exists that's so far to the right on guns. And
Hmm.
I think the only thing I would say is, I get frustrated by people who think they can get extremists to vote the right way.
Mm.
They can't. Those extremists that are in office have to be replaced with moderates again. The
Mhm.
only thing that extremist Republicans will listen to is losing their jobs. There have to be
Right. Right.
repercussions,
Yes.
I've seen a lot of, like, very well-meaning Republican white women come into the gun safety movement because their schools have been impacted.
Yeah.
They're in a southern state, and suddenly they're like, "I am attractive and wealthy, and I'm going to go into my office, my elected official's office, and I'm going to change their mind." It doesn't happen.
Right.
And the reason it doesn't happen is because there have been no consequences for being on the wrong side of this issue. And I'll
Mm.
just give you an
Mm.
example. So when the Manchin Toomey Act failed in 2013, right after the Sandy Hook school shooting, it was a bill that would have closed the background check loophole in honor of that shooting tragedy. And it failed. When it failed, the Democrats who voted against it said, I heard more from my constituents to vote against this than to vote in favor of it. Something like 3-1. And the reason they voted against it really was because they thought, if I go up against the gun, if I do what the gun lobby wants me to do, then they will have my back in the primary. Well, that didn't happen. The NRA went in and invested in every single Republican race. Democrats lost,
Right.
Republicans won. The good part of that was it gave them permission to vote their conscience going forward, lose their NRA ratings. Flash forward to 2022, when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, 15 Republican senators voted for it because they were hearing from their constituents 8-1
Wow.
in favor of voting for it. And Mitch McConnell whipped the votes in favor of it because he was seeing polling that showed they were going to lose in the midterms if they didn't do something after Buffalo and Uvalde, right?
Wow.
So there has to be consequences for these actions. And what I always am
Mm.
saying to Republican white women is, use that power that you have to elect Democrats instead
Right.
of these Republicans, or to go into the primaries and vote more moderate Republicans, because you're not going to change the hearts and minds of some of these extremists.
Mm.
Wow.
So when we think about extremists, because now we're all forced to share space with them, I think about the kind of vitriol that can be spewed in these interactions, and that have you've been called like every single name in the book.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
I wonder about like how, because we are sharing space with these folks, and because not just the electeds have become more extremist, but also in a lot of ways, so have the constituents
Yes.
become more extremist. How do you and how do we like steel ourselves spiritually, prepare ourselves spiritually for those encounters? Like, is there an approach that you've used that you have found effective in speaking across difference to people who, like, I don't know. I mean, you just said we can't convince extremists to
Yeah,
like
I don't
change.
think we can. I don't think we can convince extremists, and whether they're elected officials or their constituents. The
Mhm.
good news is that in America is a very small minority. The
Mm.
super extremists who
Mm.
believe the Second Amendment, is like carte blanche to do whatever you want with a gun, and you can pass no laws at all that regulate guns. That is a very vocal minority that for a long time held so much sway over making laws and how we culturally, electorally, legislatively, like how we thought about guns.
Yeah.
But there is a huge part of America, Republicans and Democrats alike, who believe that the Second Amendment has been exploited, and who are afraid for their children in their schools, and
Sure.
who who don't necessarily want an assault rifle, or, there are all different ranges of opinions on this. But there was a poll not too long ago that showed most Republican women and Democratic women shared the same ideas about how to solve gun safety in this
Wow.
country and supported those. And anecdotally, I've knocked doors with so many women who are running for office, and Republicans answer in very rural conservative areas, and they say, like, you can put your sign up in my yard. I'm really scared about school shootings.
Wow.
So
Wow.
there is common ground in this country. It is how we
Wow.
passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I don't believe that every conservative is an extremist,
Yeah,
Right.
and
of
I
course.
don't believe we should stop having those conversations.
Yeah, do you think that perhaps this is true, like, perhaps it's just what we see on the news or what we see on social media that convinces us that the other side is an extremist version of kind of our worst nightmare, and I think
Yeah.
that this does happen, um, I think this does happen for people who see themselves as Republicans. They start to kind of, like, demonize, um leftists or Democrats even. Yeah, so maybe it is just that there are vastly more people who are willing to have a conversation than kind of what is portrayed to us in our information streams.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think social media is very polarizing, and you're seeing sort of the most. It encourages the most extreme
Of course.
conversations on both
Yeah,
sides. I'll just give you an example. My
unfortunately.
dad is a three-time Trump voter, um,
Wow.
Wow.
very Catholic and very
Wow.
pro-life, and
Okay.
yeah, he was in the seminary for 10 years, and when I was before he married my mom, and it just sort of had
Wow.
this right wing turn, which coincided with watching Fox News, by the way. But he when I started Moms Demand Action, he was
Yeah.
very opposed to it, and
Mm.
he thought I
Mm.
was undermining the Constitution and being unpatriotic. Both my
Wow.
grandfathers were World War II veterans,
Wow.
and we just had conversations about it, right? Like I would share information, and he would see what I was doing, and he would see these school shootings happen, and eventually, now, again, this is not my political agenda, but my dad decided that gun safety was part of his pro-life agenda, that if he was anti-abortion,
Wow.
he also needed to be pro-gun safety. And he started
Hmm.
showing up at Moms Demand Action meetings in his red shirt. And,
Wow.
not everyone is going to have a change of heart and mind like that. And but I do think that it can occur. I've seen it occur because of conversations.
That's
Wow.
cool.
I
That's really
mean,
cool. It sounds like that happened over a long period of time too.
Yeah,
yeah.
Like a dogged approach, which I think
yeah,
is how I've seen change happen as well. That incrementalism that you were
yes,
saying does seem to also apply to our intimate, like, personal relationships.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that what you're describing too is something that I've thought a lot about, which is that we have to be like spiritually audacious before the politics catches
Mm,
up, which is extremely challenging because I think that, especially, and this is just my personal experience on the left at least, there's not as much discussion or talk about spirituality or about
yeah.
faith. And so, as we're leading, although we're seeing changes now with James Tallarico in Texas running for the US Senate. But, as you're leading, then you might feel like there's a groundlessness. And so it becomes even more challenging to figure out, well, what's right and what's wrong. And I feel like what you have done just from your background, I also know that I'm not sure if you still are practicing, but Buddhism was and remains, it seems, central to how you think about the fight
Yes.
of gun safety and also all of the political fights that are in front of you. And so I think you've demonstrated what it means to be spiritually audacious when the politics hasn't caught up. But for you, I'm curious how you would define that, especially as you're defined publicly as an incredibly courageous, audacious leader and woman.
Yeah, and my spiritual journey is interesting. As I said, I was raised by a former Jesuit seminarian. I went to
Jesuits.
Catholic school. I went to Mass every Sunday. I went to religion on Tuesdays. Like it was a big part of my life. And I had an agnostic mother. So that was very interesting. I'm an
Wow.
only child. And
Wow.
as I got older, it just became clear to me that Catholicism was not a fit for so many different reasons, but it felt like it was fear based and not a
Yeah.
toolkit for living life for me.
Yeah.
And I was always spiritually seeking something. Like I want to believe in something. I needed that grounding. And for me, when I started reading the works of Jack Kornfield and
Mm.
Sharon Salzberg and Pema Chodron and all these amazing leaders who have brought Buddhism to the Western world, it was clear to me that that's exactly what it was. It was like this amazing toolkit for how to live a life with less suffering, not just for me, but making sure I wasn't causing other people suffering. And thank God I had that grounding before starting Moms Demand Action, because it impacted everything I did. Right speech. I can remember in those early
Wow.
days, I would see people making fun of the way gun extremists looked, or, judging them online. And I just said, that's not who we are. That's not what we do. Like right speech. Right. And, how I behaved online and how I behaved in person, right action. There were just all of these things that I knew I needed to follow in order to be a good leader and an effective leader and to help keep me grounded. And Buddhism is just, that's what it's been for me. It's been incredibly helpful. Even, this idea of power, I think, is something we don't talk a lot about in activism. And power is interesting in particular because women have not had much of it.
Yeah.
And also, as we've seen in Congress, people have not lived this long and known what to do with that power,
Yeah.
that you don't hoard it for your entire life. And so when I started Moms Demand Action, I wanted to think about power as a woman. I wanted to think about power being finite. And I decided that I would ask myself every year at the beginning of the year, is this the year I step away? Because as in Buddhism, like everything is impermanent.
Yeah.
Right.
And in those early years, it was no, because it was like a startup. And then in the middle, it started to be maybe, but then there would be a horrific shooting tragedy or a piece of legislation to work on. But then when I was standing in the Rose Garden in 2022, as Joe Biden was signing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act into law, I just had this inner knowing, this is the bookend to my activism. And then I just spent the next year saying goodbye and handing the torch over to someone else and deciding, that it was time to do something else. And it's not because I'm this amazing leader. It's because I had these principles of Buddhism to help me figure out the best way to be a leader.
That's
I mean,
incredible.
it is incredible. And I mean, inner knowing is something Kendall and I talk about a lot. A lot.
Yeah, I'm
Go
so
ahead, Ken.
I want to dig into that actually,
Yeah.
like specifically, because I think that when you say inner knowing, it's really difficult if someone doesn't know how to access that, what to understand what you mean. And some of us were raised in religious traditions, so we like have the concept of there's a variety of different things to call it. You could call it the force of life itself, you could call it the Holy Spirit, you could call it that thing that is like you but not you that you can observe. What is that feeling for you, like, in your body when I don't know, this is like a kind of a woo-woo
Yeah.
question, but, like, what does it feel like to you to have an inner knowing? Like, when you were standing in the rose garden, what was it that you felt? If you could describe it, I know that's very hard,
No,
but
and
if
I
you could
have
try.
goosebumps right now. It's like when I get goosebumps, when I tear up, when I feel something so strongly, I'm a huge believer in intuition. I always listen to my intuition. Any feeling I have, I'm like, is that anxiety? Is that intuition? What is that? And then listening to it my whole life, right? Like I have just felt that intuition, inner knowing, whatever that is. And I have a track record of acting on it and knowing that that was the right way to act. And so I take it very seriously. Like when I'm standing at the Rose Garden and I suddenly feel like, oh, this is the end of your activism on this issue, I'm not a person who, I think I'm pretty self aware. Like I'm not a person who wants to do something that I shouldn't be doing anymore.
Yeah.
Is it loud? Is it quiet?
Very loud.
Very loud. And
Mhm.
how do you decipher between intuition and anxiety? Because you mentioned that, and I think that that's, like,
Great
very
question,
important.
Kendall.
I
A
think
lot of
someone once
people
tweeted,
It is.
intuition or anxiety, a memoir. Right? Like,
That's my memoir for sure. I
yeah.
love that.
I mean,
What's
I
the
would say,
difference for you? How do you decipher?
I think it's for me, and I guess I think of motherhood as just fraught with, is this intuition? Like, is my kid really in trouble, or am I just worried that they're in trouble?
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll bounce stuff off of other people because I'm like, okay, I'm too in the weeds on this, or I'm
Sure.
maybe overreacting on this. And I'm grateful to have a very very grounded husband who will say like, "Oh, this is anxiety," or maybe you should look into that. You have really strong intuition. So he kind of helps me kind
Mm.
of suss that stuff out sometimes. But I can remember when I said, "I think it's time for me to leave." He said, "Yeah, I think it's time for you to leave too. 11 years is a long time."
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I mean, it's really powerful for you to share that with us, not just personally, but also for those who will be listening too. It's definitely something that I have had a huge learning curve on. I did not listen to my intuition on, I can say, two very important occasions. And it's just like what you described, the
Mm,
loud voice, like, "This isn't for you," or like, "You're not meant to be here." And I still persisted through. And on the other side of it was not pretty, actually. It was extremely painful and
mm.
very hard. And I think sometimes you have to, I wish that
But
I
those are lessons learned.
it is, it 100%
Yeah.
is. It's lessons learned, and as you're describing it too, like you said, you have a track record of trusting those things, and then it's showing you, and that I think is that's like there's a big gap, right, between, like, I hear the thing, if I can start to hear it, and then, like, where I'm gonna go,
And can I
and
trust the thing?
right,
Mhm.
that.
Yes,
Can
because
I trust the
sometimes
thing?
you're
Yeah.
like, "Oh, this voice, who is this voice?
Yes.
Right,
What is this thing
right,
talking to me?"
right.
Let me add one more thing because I think what we're talking about here is really what Buddhists refer to as monkey mind.
Yes.
Ah.
And if you don't have a practice of
Mm,
praying or meditating or being silent, whatever that means to you, then it is really hard to decipher the monkey mind and to say,
Mhm,
like, is that someone else's thought? Is that my thought? Is that a true thought? Is that a false thought? And so what I have found is that the practice of meditation is and again, so for some people that's praying, whatever it is, for
mhm,
me it's meditation. And what it does is it trains your mind to know that thoughts and emotions are temporary and impermanent. And, like my idea is always when I'm meditating and I see something come into my mind, I see it as a cloud that floats away.
mm,
mm,
And I do think that if you can make it a practice to calm your mind, it's much harder for the monkey mind or for the endless, unceasing negative or unself-aware thoughts to creep in.
I
mm,
think that's really well said, and I wanna ask this specific question about your practice and what it looks like and how often you do it today and how often you did it, because I think one thing that I learned when I was on the treadmill of politics, it felt like there was never any time, and I know that is a story in my head, and we
It
all
is,
have
yeah.
that story, and the story comes with us, and then because we don't break that cycle, we then
yeah,
never have a practice, and then we just find ourselves in these cycles that are not actually serving us or the public or the role we're in. And so I it might seem like such a trite question, but it really isn't, because it was so hard. I never was able to find a practice while I was in the Senate.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who are leading or want to lead or especially want to lead large movements also struggle with this. And so I'm just so curious, how did you find the time? What did it look like? When was it? You also said you have 5 children and a married, right? You're extremely busy. It's not just, right, the public facing work that you're doing. Your home life, your personal life, your family life is also jam packed with action
Yeah.
and activity and life and vitality. So how did you do this?
It's 20 minutes.
Mm.
And I think, as you said, we start to tell ourselves stories. I'm too busy, or we feel anxious about being quiet for 20 minutes or being off of Twitter for 20 minutes. Whatever it is, there's so many other things you can fill that 20 minutes with.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with exercise or making a doctor's appointment or whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. It's so much easier, particularly as women, to put that on the back burner.
Mm.
My husband wakes up every single morning at 5:30 and meditates for 30 minutes. That's how he's
Wow.
built, right? I don't meditate until late afternoon. That's when I feel like, okay,
Mm.
everything's out of my way for the day. I can take this 20 minutes for myself. And sometimes it's 30, if things are going great. And, sometimes it can be an hour. But
Wow.
wow.
I, I think even 15, 20 minutes, it is about building the muscle. And you have to put it on your calendar. You have to prioritize that time. And you have to see that it will make you a better all the things you are, legislator,
Right.
mom, coworker, whatever it is. Practicing the muscle of silencing your mind and giving yourself space
Mm.
is as important as brushing your teeth and exercise and all of the other things that we do.
Mm.
Mm, yeah. It's I mean, it looks
Mm,
so different for each person, and I always love hearing how people like, what works for them and how they
yeah.
find it. I know that for me, at the beginning of kind of trying to quiet my mind, it I was, like, running, running, running so far away from everything in my life that I first just needed to, like, keep my brain occupied doing something like running. Like,
Mhm.
running became meditative for me simply because it was like all I could think about was the act of running because it was so
Mm.
damn painful that that was quieting. But
Yep,
having too much quiet would have been like perhaps like a little too traumatic.
Yeah.
So everyone has to find their
totally.
thing. But I
And
love
there are tons of
hearing.
apps too,
Yes.
Jack Cornfield has a lot of great meditations online that I find really helpful. There's also Calm app, there are all these different
Yeah.
ways that
Hmm.
can help you so that you're not just like, "Okay, what do I do while I sit here?"
Mm,
Okay, so what do you use on your hardest days? The
yeah.
days when there's another mass shooting, a legislative failure, something's wrong with your kids. Like, is there an emergency spiritual toolkit that you go to? Or is it just the fact that you can like rely on that consistent practice, that you always have that? Or like, are in those days do you not even like put the pressure on yourself to do that? Like,
Mm,
how do you deal
Yeah,
with the
I do.
overwhelm?
I try to give myself some grace. When I was still at Moms Demand Action, I can't tell you how many vacations were impacted by horrific shooting tragedies. I
Mm,
would
yep.
be with my husband on a getaway and I'd say, I'm done. Like, I have to go do television for the next 48 hours. I have to do all
mm,
of these things. Like, I'm done and I'm going to be in the hotel room. I'm really lucky and grateful that I have this incredibly supportive partner. I think that's a huge part, for those of us who have partners, is that it's someone who can sort of take over and do the difficult stuff while you have to do whatever it is that you have to focus on. My kids are very understanding too. And I do think anger is something I lean into when those things
Mm,
happen.
mhm,
So I don't get overwhelmed by the sadness. I really have to lean into like, this is outrageous and we're going to fix it.
mhm,
yeah.
Um, and sure, there are times when I just don't have time to meditate
mhm,
or I forget to meditate, whatever it is, but I notice in myself that I just don't feel as good. I don't feel as clear, and I don't feel like myself if I'm not doing it.
Mm. Is there any inner work that you're doing now that's not necessarily visible to the public or even to maybe to your family? Maybe this is some new practice that you're thinking about or a new mantra that you have running through your mind, especially because times that like you mentioned, it's not 2012, it's not even 2016. This is an extraordinary time
Yeah,
and it calls for extraordinary efforts
yeah.
beyond what we're used to.
Yeah, I mean, what has been interesting to me, I stepped back from Moms Demand Action at the end of 2023, and I thought, okay, I'm done with activism, or I don't know what I'm going to do. And I ended up having Maria Shriver ask me to write a book for her imprint. And that book has opened so many doors and so many new ways for
Mm,
me to be, talking about summoning the audacity of women. A lot of people say, "Oh, you're so lucky you found your life's work," meaning gun violence prevention. Actually, my life's work is empowering other women. And
mm,
that's been
mm,
the through line of my life. And I think hopefully it will be till the end. What I
mm,
find so much enjoyment in is, I partnered with Indivisible to have events to promote Kamala Harris. I'm partnering with Red, Wine, and Blue to create these community groups. There's all these different things that I'm able to do now to support other groups and other women. And I really love not being in the spotlight and not being the strategist, but being the supportive person right now.
sure.
I'm
mm.
really getting a lot out of
Yes.
that. And I'm on the board of Emerge America. So encouraging women to run too is something I think is really needed and powerful.
Mm. I think that to the point that you're making about encouraging women to run and inspiring women to be leaders and also to be in the background, I think what you're talking about is often not spoken about in leadership. That well, at least it's not spoken about as much as perhaps we would want it to be spoken about, which is this specific phenomenon because it is one where you are in the spotlight, you're leading, you're doing what you need to do, and then you realize I'm a little bit tired. I've done what I think I need to do here. I'm not necessarily done forever, but it's time to step away or to, as I like to say, come down the mountain, which is something that our culture does not necessarily help us to do, right? It's all about like, how do you hack to the get to the top, and like, what do
And
you
stay there
do,
And
forever.
and
stay
stay
there
there forever
forever.
and
Yeah.
grip it until your fingers fall off. It's
Yeah.
like, which we're seeing in our Congress, right? People holding on too long.
Yes.
It's so obvious, it's almost like ridiculous at this point, and yet it's an unfortunate thing that we have to live with and reap the unfortunate results of. And so, you know, you've talked about this a few times now, but you stepped back from leadership. You had that feeling inside of you that it was time to go. So then when you spent that year, right, telling saying goodbyes to people, what were some of the pieces of infrastructure that you put in place, right?
Mm,
Spiritually and politically, and also legacy wise, because I think
Mm.
sometimes when people leave political roles, they're not so thoughtful about
mhm.
the legacy for the next person. They're thoughtful about their legacy, which
Yeah.
is real. But you have been thoughtful about the legacy of others and the legacy of Mom's Demand. Like you're keeping that link strong because you understand how important it is. And so that is, to me, seeing what that looks like is, I think, so important because it's often something that we don't see behind the scenes of. And so what else did that open up for you as you were doing that?
There's something in the tech world called founder syndrome. It's this idea that if you do
Yeah.
anything, and they mean mainly starting a tech company, but I think it applies to anything you start. It could be giving birth to your kids. It could be starting a new job. It could be something that's really important to you. Whatever that thing is, if your ego gets enmeshed in it, when it's over and everything ends, right? When that thing is over, and that might be like your kid goes to college, whatever that is,
Right.
you either want to your ego's so enmeshed that you either want to burn it down so that it doesn't exist without you, or that thing is so dependent on you that it can't exist without you. And so because I
Yeah.
knew I wanted Moms Demand Action to be temporary for me, I never imagined it would be 11 years, but even then, that I would step away in a way that I had to manage my ego so that I did not become so enmeshed in the organization that it either I wanted to burn it down or couldn't survive without me.
Hmm.
And so that was my goal, right, throughout this
It's
whole
so hard.
decade. And
So
that is
hard.
not to say there was no suffering when I left Moms Demand Action. There absolutely was. I mean, my whole identity for 11 years was the founder of Moms Demand Action. Because I knew there would be suffering, I had a therapist. My husband
Mm,
understood that he needed to be the one to tell me over and over again why I made this decision. I found other things to do that were of interest to me. There were so many different things that I had to do in that year to stay, to manage my ego and to stay in the decision that I had made.
Mm.
And, when you're, as anyone knows, like if you leave a job, when you're off the team, you're off the team.
right.
So when I
Yeah.
started to say goodbye, I was no longer really on the team,
Yeah.
and,
Big.
that is there will be suffering with that. That is
Mm.
not a reason to hold on to power, to avoid that suffering. It's gonna come, and if you plan for it and you have a support system, it makes the suffering less.
Mm.
Wow. One of my favorite people, who I'm sure you also know, Brittany Packnett Cunningham.
Oh, it's
I
the
remember
best.
she told me once that she was just burning out. She was burning at both ends. She was doing the work. She's an organizer and an activist, very similar to you, Shannon. And for our listeners who might not be familiar, go check out Brittany Packnett.
Yeah.
But I remember she told me once, like, I got so burned out, and I had this feeling like if I'm not there, then it's not going to happen. And I realized that that was just like so my ego telling me that they can't do it without me. They were actually totally fine.
Yeah.
And that was harder to admit than I
Yeah.
wanted it to be. I wanted them to need me. But I think so often when we're in these spaces where we're leading movements, it and we're burning out.
Yeah.
It can feel like, oh well, I should just push through, I should just keep going. But actually that the best thing for the work that you're doing is to sometimes, like, walk away
Yeah.
and refuel yourself for the next
Yeah.
thing, and it's very
Yeah.
clear to me and to us, I think, that you've found the next thing between the book, Fired Up, between being this, like, leader and empowerer of women's audacity, which I think is
Yeah.
so awesome, because we need women all over the country, all over the world even, to feel like they have a place in leadership, whether that be like the leadership of their house, the
Yeah.
leadership of their school, their community, their church, their, eh, their state, their government, their country, all of those things. So it really does seem like you've, from the outside looking in, made that transition in
Yeah.
such a beautiful and meaningful way. So congrats to
Mm,
you because
thank
I think
you.
that's
Yeah.
so hard. It really is so
Yeah.
hard. As we wrap up here, one question that we always love to ask people um, is about what you've believed in the past and what you've had to unlearn. We like to practice being wholehearted and half sure in public because that can be scary. So, what do you believe now that you didn't believe when you started this work, and what have you had to unlearn?
I guess I think the most of it is the way I assimilated into culture, this capitalistic culture pre-moms, which
Mm,
was sharp elbows, very bossy,
hmm,
very ambitious, very determined, and not as kind as I could have been.
mm,
Mm.
And what Moms Demand Action taught me, working with volunteers,
Mm.
working with survivors, is that like kindness is so incredibly important above all. And the purpose of life, as corny as it is, it's like community and love and feeling that alchemy, feeling that
Yeah.
mm,
sense of divine that I was talking about before. And that only comes from empathy and compassion and kindness. And all the other stuff is just like a road to unhappiness.
mm.
Wow. What a way to end. And also, what a model, frankly, for not just us, but for everyone who will listen to this, because it is so challenging in those spaces to remember that because you're also battling a feeling of survival, right? You have to like hold your place at the top, or at least we're taught to hold your place
Yeah.
at the top and like keep relevance and keep bringing things to the group that actually are meaningful and matter, and like it's such an important thing to also unlearn
Yeah.
to be able to be our best and highest and most impactful leaders in selves. So, thank you.
Thank
Yeah, thank you
you.
so much for joining us,
It's a great
Shannon. This
talk. I
was
really appreciate it.
a
We
true
appreciate
honor.
you.